the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Good morning, Mayor. As you've heard me say multiple times before, just get about 12 to 15 inches from the microphone. It does adjust up, down, left, right, but if you're just speaking a loud, clear voice, we'll be able to hear everything.
Good morning. Would you tell us your full name?
Barbara J. Russell.
And tell us a little bit about your education.
I have a master's degree in clinical social work. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology.
And the current position that you hold employment-wise?
I am self-employed. I have a clinical and forensic mental health practice
How long have you had such a practice?
for about 15 years.
Would it be correct in addressing you as Dr. Russell?
Yes, certainly.
All right. Dr. Russell, have you appeared before in the courts of the state of Florida and been recognized as an expert?
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of approximately how many occasions?
Typically, I testify in court as an expert in the state of Florida about 3 times a month for the last 8 or 9 years.
Have you, in that capacity, appeared in the courts of Manatee County on a regular basis?
Yes, sir.
Specifically, have you appeared before Judge White in previous proceedings as an expert on mental health?
Yes, sir.
I want to ask you, Dr. Russell, amongst your other specialties, are you qualified to diagnose and treat PTSD?
Yes. It's one of my specialties in both my clinical and forensic practice.
All right. Would you tell us what PTSD stands for?
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
And are you also qualified, in addition to PTSD, Dr. Russell, to treat domestic violence and abuse?
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of your experience in the domestic violence area on behalf of both abusers and abused?
I'm a nationally certified domestic violence clinical specialist. I have treated victims since early 1990 in various outpatient services, providing support groups, individual counseling. I have, for Circuit 12, provided court-ordered domestic violence intervention classes for offenders for about 8 years.
Right, and among other instances, have you been involved with the Batters Intervention Program as well?
Yes.
I want to ask you a few questions about Douglas Benefield. Did you have an opportunity in your capacity as a psychologist to interview him?
Yes.
Do you recall approximately when that would have been?
That would have been in April of 2020.
And approximately how long did that interview last?
He spoke with me for about 90 minutes.
Were you satisfied during the course of that interview that you had sufficient time to render a diagnosis of Mr. Benefield's personality?
Between that interview and also the collateral data, the documentation that I viewed, yes, very much so.
Would you tell us what that diagnosis was and your basis for it?
Douglas Benefield exhibited criteria that met the diagnostic categories of narcissistic and antisocial personality disorder.
And how, if at all, would that fold itself into being a potential abuser?
Well, the antisocial components, as well as the narcissistic components, he had little to no empathy. He really lacked the capacity to take responsibility for his behavior. He had a desire to be admired, to have constant attention. He felt very entitled and demanding to the attention and admiration of other people, whether or not he did anything to deserve it. And he had little regard for the rights of other people.
Are you familiar, Dr. Russell, with Ashley Benefield?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not Ashley Benefield, as she sits here today before you, is currently suffering from any specific condition?
Yes.
Would you tell us what that is?
Ashley is suffering from post-traumatic stress.
And are you able to give us some insight into the basis that caused that syndrome that she suffers from?
It's really been caused by complex trauma. The root cause all comes down to the abusive relationship with Douglas Benefield. From the time the abuse began in their marriage up until the incident of the attack that led to the shooting on September 27th, there have been multiple situations that have severely distressed and traumatized her.
So I want to ask you a couple of questions about post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I'll use as an example the soldier that comes home from combat. Is there anything about this syndrome that requires or necessitates an instant response to stimuli immediately after the traumatic event, or is that liable to happen at any time over the spectrum of conditions and circumstances that that individual may experience?
Symptoms can be delayed onset. So somebody can experience a severe trauma in January and perhaps not exhibit any kind of reactivity to stimuli that reminds them of that, or any emotional distress for days, weeks, months, even years later. So it's not unusual to see in November somebody have a problem, or even, again, years later. Delayed onset's common.
So again, using this hypothetical soldier as an example, 3 months after they return home following combat duty, they may not respond to any stimuli, but you're telling us as long as 18 months, 2 years later, when a spoon happens to fall into the garbage disposal and makes a clattering noise and they dive onto the floor, that would not be unusual.
No, it would not be.
Are you familiar, Dr. Russell, with the facts of this case and the circumstances surrounding the shooting?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not Douglas Benefield's conduct contributed to his death?
Absolutely.
Objection and proper opinion.
Overruled.
Yes, absolutely.
And how so?
Douglas Benefield had a history of violent behavior. Douglas had been threatening Ashley, becoming increasingly aggressive in the weeks and days leading up to the shooting. He had been making verbal threats to her life. He was in her home. He was refusing to leave her home. He was acting in a manner very typical of Doug, only exacerbated at that time. He behaved in a manner that made her feel as though her life was in danger, that she was at serious risk of being killed or being seriously hurt.
Did there come a time, Dr. Russell, when you were approached by representatives of the Manatee County Sheriff's Office who asked that specific question?
Yes.
Did you respond to them with basically the information you've given us here today?
Yes.
Tell us about whether or not you have formed an opinion as to Ms. Benefield's psychological state at the time of this incident.
At the time of the incident, she was acting under extreme duress. She was in full survival mode, fully believing that her life was in danger. She was responding with an effort to stay alive. there's a process that happens in the human mind when we feel that our lives are in danger. We have to make survival decisions, and these decisions are made in fractions of seconds. Even outside our conscious awareness, we're assessing the situation, assessing our capacity to escape, assessing our capacity to fight back. And people make decisions based on what their survival brain, as I call it, tells them is going to keep them alive. She was doing what was biologically natural in a situation where somebody would feel that their life was in danger. And this was also compounded by the weeks, months, years of knowing Douglas Benefield to be violent and being afraid of him.
Did you, Dr. Russell, have any opportunities to actually observe Ashley Benefield's reaction around males and the manifestation of this post-traumatic stress syndrome and her comfort level?
Yes.
Tell us about it.
In the weeks, really the early months following the shooting, when Ashley was staying at my home, I would notice in particular, she would frequently apologize for things that didn't require an apology. She especially did that around my husband. If she was in the kitchen making a protein shake in the morning and he came in to make coffee, she always felt like she was in the way. She was always very quick to say she was sorry, to kind of flinch or pull back in a manner that was just completely, appeared to be unnecessary based on the situation. You know, there was never any indication from him that she was being bothersome in any way. But she had an expectation that she was going to get yelled at or that somebody was going to be mad at her. I had noticed another occasion. My son had stopped by our house in the evening. It was dark unexpectedly. She looked out the window and saw a male figure approaching, and she came screaming through the house saying, "Someone's here, someone's approaching the house." She was very hyper-aroused and reactive to situations, particularly with men.
Your Honor, I don't believe I have any further questions for Dr. Russell.
Cross?
Are you familiar with something called histrionic personality disorder?
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Histrionic personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of a person being very melodramatic to gain attention.
And are you aware that the defendant in this case has been diagnosed with that?
I'm aware that that's a false diagnosis, but yes.
So in your opinion, it's a false diagnosis? But
Absolutely. Women who've been victimized by domestic...
I didn't ask the question.
Oh, excuse
In
me.
your-
Excuse me. She's, Dr. Russell.
Let her finish. Go ahead, ma'am. You finish your answer.
Yes. Women who have experienced victimization of intimate partner violence are often mischaracterized as being histrionic when the individual assessing them does not have a proper understanding or a complete picture of what has been going on in their lives.
And according to your beliefs, you believe that you do have that background and you are able to diagnose it quickly.
Absolutely.
And would you consider yourself unbiased when it comes to Ashley Benefield and Doug Benefield?
Absolutely.
Okay. So after you had your initial evaluation with Ashley Benefield, that was in, I think, April of 2020,
Correct.
you continued contact with her,
Correct.
and she had your phone number,
Of course, all of my clients have my phone number.
and she would call you on a regular basis.
She would call me on a regular basis to update me on what was going on in her situation, per my instruction, as there was potentially an upcoming court hearing regarding her situation.
And she would copy you on emails to her attorney.
I don't know. I don't recall that.
There were several emails that were sent to her family law attorney that had you CC'd on them.
Okay.
Would you agree with that?
That's a real possibility.
So as a therapist, is it normal to have a client CC you on their correspondence with their attorneys?
Yes, if I'm involved in a capacity where I could be testifying at a family law hearing or at an injunction hearing. That's very typical.
Okay. So several months, well, several weeks, I suppose, after this homicide, she moved into your house.
Yes,
And your house, she lived with you, your husband, and your daughter.
correct.
And she lived there approximately a total of 8 months.
Approximately, yes.
And the night that this shooting occurred, you were called on the phone.
I was called by her attorney, yes.
Okay. And you showed up to the house where the murder happened.
Where the shooting happened, yes.
Okay. And that's a normal part of being a therapist? You show up at somebody's house when there's been a crime?
I have shown up at people's houses, at their place of employment, at a hospital emergency room. Crisis intervention is very much a part of being a mental health professional.
And you know about the demonstrators that were out in front of the courthouse on numerous occasions during this case, correct?
Yes,
Holding signs, Free Ashley.
yes, that's the Community Defense Committee called We Stand with Ashley. I'm familiar with that.
On numerous occasions, you were also out there holding signs
Yes,
and marching with this group.
yes,
And you still consider yourself unbiased?
absolutely. It's part of my ethical obligation as a licensed clinical social worker to be involved in situations that involve injustice.
Now, you said that you were able to diagnose Doug Benefield after a 90-minute phone conversation and I believe you said collateral documentation.
Yes,
And a lot of that collateral documentation a lot of it included the paperwork for these injunctions that Ashley Benefield was trying to get against Doug Benefield, correct?
what do you mean by the paperwork?
The recitation of what Ashley said Doug had done and the things that she was trying to tell the court that Doug had done, trying to get the injunction.
No, that had nothing to do with my forming my opinion. In fact, the documents that I looked at that formed my clinical opinion of Douglas Benefield were mostly things that he documented, that he wrote, that he did. It was based on his behavior, not what somebody else says about him.
But it did include what Ashley Benefield said about him.
Not the documentation that I formed my opinion about him. Absolutely not.
Are you saying that what Ashley Benefield told you had nothing to do with your opinion?
My opinion in what was going on with him clinically had to do with the words that came out of his mouth as he talked to me for 90 minutes and the various correspondence and documentation that came from him, his emails to other people, things that he had documented, things that he told me that he did.
Okay, so after this evaluation and right before the time of the shooting, you said, I believe, that Doug was increasingly violent and it was becoming more dire, right?
Yes,
And you knew this because Ashley's telling you.
yes.
You didn't witness this for yourself.
No, I did. The only thing I witnessed were some of the text messages that he was sending her.
Okay, but you never saw any of the other evidence that he was becoming increasingly violent?
No, it was what she was reporting to me that he was saying and the messages that she was forwarding, some of which were quite threatening in nature.
I have no further questions, thank you.
Redirect?
No, sir.
All right, thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, Judge White.
All right, did you have anybody else that either had testimony or wanted to make statements?
Statement by me, no further testimony.
Oh, just closing?
Thank you, Dr. Russell.